Welcome to our first video lecture. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Elizabethan Poor Law and the implication of poor law on contemporary social welfare policy in Canada. This historical discussion doesn't include a discussion of First Nations peoples and Indigenous issues. So I'd just like to mention the Indian Act, which is a significant piece of legislation that affects the health and well-being and access to social policy resources for First Nations people. Traditionally, the federal government has been responsible for Indigenous people and the provision of services and resources to Indigenous people, and they haven't done a very good job of it. At times, the federal government has also divested some of the provision of services to the provinces, and so we see that this further creates inequity between Indigenous communities and mainstream communities, because oftentimes the funding available to provide services to First Nations communities is unequal to that of the mainstream community on a per capita basis. And so we see advocates like Cindy Blackstock in a contemporary context have challenged this historical responsibility and reality and have sought retribution and justice through the court system. We will talk more about Indigenous issues in future sections of the course. This historical focuses more on the colonial power of Britain and its influence in a Canadian context. We're concerning ourselves right now with British poor law, sometimes referred to as Elizabethan poor law. And there are many iterations of this, starting from about 1536. The erosion and elimination of the feudal system of land rights in Britain and a more structured system for land ownership shifted the way in which relations of social welfare needed to exist within the context of the country. And the British monarchy and British government decided to do away with systems whereby landlords were responsible for the health and well-being of peasants who worked their land. In part, this was because of ill feelings and tension between landowners based on the fact that different landowners would respond to the needs and poverty and suffering of the peasants that worked their land, some being more generous and some less generous. Those that were less generous felt that those that were more generous were making them look bad, and that the expectation of peasants was becoming unrealistic. In addition, there were a number of natural disasters related to weather and disease that created a lot of death within the United Kingdom, which meant that there was a reduction in population. Whenever there's a reduction in population, usually a shortage of workers or certain kinds of workers follows, which puts pressure on the wages and working conditions of those workers. So fewer peasants meant that the peasants that existed could demand more from their landlords. And so the British government and British monarchy decided to put a stop to that. Also, there was a need for people to be working, and so as part of the British Poor Law of 1536, something known as the Labourer's Statute was introduced, and this required that anyone who was able-bodied must work. The distribution of charity resources became institutionalized and centralized through parish systems. Those who were deemed to be the deserving poor were provided with begging licenses, and these begging licenses allowed those individuals to beg, basically, to ask for resources and to be seen as a legitimately needy person. This began the establishment of what we now refer to as the deserving and undeserving poor, with the deserving poor receiving outside relief or charity that would allow them to remain in their own dwelling, while the undeserving poor were institutionalized in poorhouses or workhouses. The principle of lesser eligibility, which we still use today, was also introduced. And this principle means that any charity you receive has to be worth value of less than what one would earn at the minimum level of working. So in other words, whatever benefits you receive from government or from other institutions has to be less than what you would earn working full-time at the minimum wage. As I mentioned previously, there were many iterations of British Poor Law, so we're going to skip a little bit ahead to 1834 when a British Poor Law was introduced that produced a more punitive kind of system. Here is where we start to make connections between morality and poverty and unemployment. People who experienced poverty and unemployment were considered feckless and to have some kind of poor moral fiber, a kind of poor morality that required some kind of punishment and re-education in order to correct. All poor people were seen as undeserving under the statutes of 1834, but there were some who were considered more deserving than others. So in other words, if you became poor because of age or poor because of disability, well, it was still your own fault that you were poor, or it was some kind of, divine retribution for the sins of your forefathers. But there were some people who might deserve to receive some support. So here we see institutions providing charity becoming much more popular and much more varied. So we see the introduction of workhouses, orphanages, poorhouses, hospitals, and asylum. And people were categorized based on the reason for their experience of poverty and their need for resources and charity. Within these institutions, there was a climate or a culture of forced work. So people were expected to work, even if they were hospitalized or in an asylum, in order to maintain the institution. They had to pay their own way by contributing within the institution. This included children who were placed into service. Obviously, orphanages were for very young children, but older children over about the age of 6 were often indentured to farmers or to factories. To factory owners. So you may have relatives or have read stories about people who are home children. And those are children from the British Isles, from the United Kingdom, who were sent overseas, for example, to Canada, to work on farms. And these children had to work until the age of 18 or 21, depending on the contract that they had, for free for the person they were indentured to. And then once they had worked until either 18 or 21, they would have paid off things like their passage and their room and board, and they would then be considered free of the indenturement, and they could go off and work in some other context. Again, famine, disease, and immigration put stress on the working realities in the United Kingdom. There were fewer people available to work in this time of great industrialization. And so there was an expectation that all of those who were able-bodied would work. The most deserving, let's say someone who had been, say, injured on the job or injured in military service, would receive charity at home. The remaining folks deemed undeserving or less deserving would be provided with resources within institutions. I've included this link to a poster and some other resources that would allow you to look at some art, in particular a poster that was created to represent life inside of the workhouse. So remember, we have a population with low literacy in 1834, and so a poster depicting images of what it might be like to live or work in a poorhouse could be helpful and also a deterrent for people who might in some way perceive the workhouse to be an easier life than working outside. Here we see various people engaging in work like beating hemp or beating other kinds of plant material, preparing it for cloth making. We see young children basket making. We see an elderly man being forced to work by the warden of the almshouse, and we see a variety of different people being punished in the background, strung up by the waist, the arm, and the legs, and we see people chained to the wall being whipped. You'll also notice in the corner of the image a wagon. And inside that wagon are the people who have died in the workhouse. And their bodies are being sold to the local medical school for the use of the study of anatomy. So, as a person committed to an almshouse or a workhouse, you would not even have dignity in death. Your body would be sold to recoup some of the expenses for caring for you. So it was certainly an inhumane and undignified experience for people who were placed in these contexts. So this attitude towards work and the expectation of all able-bodied people to engage in gainful work is reflected in this story from a 1911 newsletter, which illustrates we have a child who is 4 years old who is working with her mother shucking oysters in an oyster processing plant in Scotland. You can see that this 4-year-old was also responsible for childcare when she was not working, because I think children could not work full-time, but they could work limited hours. We also see that the lack of childcare means that Mary's mother is sometimes also working with a child in her arms, as they have a child in the family that is unwell, a baby that is sick. And that all members of the family are employed and engaged in productive work. Mary's mother is described as one of the fastest oyster shuckers in the plant, earning as much as $1.50 a day, which was a pretty good wage at that time. The idea of the deserving and the undeserving poor is something that facilitated the introduction of social work. So we often talk about social work's history as relating in some ways to women's good work or the charity work that affluent women would do. So connected to various church organizations, charity organizations, society volunteers, or friendly visitors would be responsible for what is sometimes referred to as retail change or change at the individual and family level. They would reinforce the connection between poverty and morality established under the Poor Law by identifying deserving and undeserving poor people, and also administering needs and means tests to those who were deemed more deserving, so that the kinds of resources that they might need for outside relief or relief provided to them in their dwelling could be determined. Mary Richmond is often described as one of the people who established the criteria for charity organization society work in North America through her original textbook called Social Diagnosis. So charity organization society workers were also responsible for ensuring that those who did receive charity were adhering to any rules or stipulations that were placed upon them. And these workers began to identify with the notion of professionalism and specialized expertise. And out of this volunteer women's good work style of practice, we see the origins of social casework developed. I'm sure that a lot of this information is familiar to many of you, or has become, familiar again. It's maybe jogged your memory of some of the things that you learned in your undergrad if it's been a while. We certainly can see the relationship between these historical realities in our contemporary practice, and we're going to explore this more when we talk a little bit about the Depression in the next video lecture. Thanks very much, and I'll look forward to connecting with you on Zoom.